up, everybody? Hope you all are enjoying your ride on the stationary Earth. Before we get started with the show, there's a few rules we need to go over. Rule number one, there's no reason to fasten your seatbelt because you are to remain absolutely stationary for the duration of this show. There will be no spinning around a curve at 66,600 miles per hour at any point during this presentation. Anyone who decides to disobey this rule will be ejected from the face of the stationary Earth at 66,600 miles per hour. Rule number one also applies to the solar frame of reference as well as the galactic frame of reference, in which case you will be ejected from the face of the Earth at nearly a half a million miles per hour or over a million miles per hour, respectively, plus or minus depending on the time of day and the time of year you happen to see this film. Rule number two, there will be no upside down people allowed to view this video. You are to remain oriented in an upright position for the duration of this presentation. That means Globers in Australia must stand on your head, unless the first person to see this documentary happens to be in Australia, in which case the subsequent viewers must stand on their head depending on their relative position to the person in Australia who first tuned in. But of course, this video was created in North America on a flat Earth, so as long as you don't believe in the globe lies anymore, then you'll do just fine sitting upright, regardless of latitude or longitude conditions in your area. Of course, if you live in Australia and you believe you live on a ball, then you must stand on your head in order to remain in adherence to rule number two. We simply will not tolerate any upside-down nations full of people during the length of this broadcast as it distracts from the presentation, and many of you are not wearing any underwear, certainly billions of them in China who are automatically disqualified from participating, although we can't necessarily blame them as they don't get free, real internet. We'll forgive the people in China whose balls are showing. However, anyone who speaks Cantonese could at least give the freaking Chinese people a clue to Google Flat Earth from the American Embassy. To the people in China who are currently upside down, since America is on top of the globe, duh, I'm very sorry that your totalitarian government allows you to see an approved version and an approved version only of the internet, and I apologize for making light of that tragedy. I will, however, point out that this is exactly the way our puppet so-called representatives would like to see our internet become here in America. But who gives a damn about the selected sheep officials? As we all know, they've gotten a fist up their rear, beholden to the polling data, the corporate oaths, and of course their beloved status quo. Our scam-elected sheeperment officials would sooner take a payoff from the military-industrial complex than to uphold any semblance of morality or responsibility to their constituents they claim to have, but I digress. Rule number three, I doubt anyone will actually enforce these rules except for me, but there will be no space-time allowed in this forum. By direct extension, since there will be no space-time allowed in this discussion, there will also be no warping of space-time allowed either, including but not limited to wormholes, Einstein-Rosen bridges, black holes, supermassive black holes, large hadron colliders recreating the conditions moments after the Big Bang, and gravity as a warping of space-time, since space-time is a fabrication dreamed up by a shill with free will named Albert. And by free will, I mean a fist up his rear, by the way. And this discussion is based in measurable scientific fact, ergo, rule number two is meant to uphold our intolerance for the musings of hypothetical surrealist sheeple's daydreams. Anyone caught in possession of the theory of space-time during this lecture will be pwned by density ebuoyancy, as well as Michelson-Morley, and Airy's failure. If caught conspiring to bring the theory of space-time into this discussion, you will be immediately schooled on a fundamental lesson in physics which involves physical evidence, not the musings of a puppet named Albert. Space-time is an imaginary, hypothetical construct of a very creative, possibly dubious person named Albert. The theory of relativity involving space-time as some sort of constant, rectilinear, interconnected mesh or fabric is not any sort of scientific fact. Albert's theory of space-time as a constant, rectilinear fabric which is comprised of exactly nothing somehow warps around the shape of the non-existing spherical Earth to magically become the great theory of gravity which has never been proven or even observed All of that brilliant theorizing and tidy calculations by Albert are equivalent in relevance to the dream of a fart. The puppet named Albert told you that space and time were connected in a fabric, and you believed him. If the puppet named Albert told you that his invisible dragon poops invisible golden eggs, does that mean it's true? Would you believe him then? Now, Albert told people that gravity could be proven by watching the light from stars bend around the sun during an eclipse, and you believed him. You see, Albert didn't want to believe in the ether, as experiments dealing with light traversing through a substance beyond our atmosphere didn't sit well with Albert Schilstein, and so he had to just change all the rules, theoretically, and simply ignored physical laws to mash together physical space with non-physical time, and claimed that it solved the problems with previous experiments such as Airy's failure and others which show the world to be stationary and the starlight or the ether as rotating above our heads in circles concentric with the North Pole. Now, I've got news for your Albert Schilstein. Space is not an infinite vacuum. The Big Bang never happened, and time is a human construct. The sun and moon provide our frame of reference for time. However, we humans tend to remember our experiences in a linear fashion and associate our experiences in order of appearance to correlate this constant thing called time. However, merging a physical area with a non-physical construct of the human brain is a very brilliant, fanciful, theoretical form of skullduggery. For starters, Albert the sticky-fingered patent clerk Schilstein, our concept of time could be relative to electromagnetic forces as opposed to gravitational forces, one of which are proven intestable, the other of which is a theory that was only dreamed up by this dead dude named Albert Schilstein. What goes up must come down is certainly a law of physics here on the ground in reality and is not exclusive to a spinning globe Earth by any stretch of the imagination. So anyone who insists upon bringing the so-called fabric of space-time into the discussion can go knit a sweater out of the fabric of space-time. Running around naked while pretending to be clothed in gravity. Perhaps when you knit your sweater with the fabric of space-time, you can demonstrate how to spin around at 1,000 miles per hour near your naked equator, while the water we throw at you sticks to your nifty, non-existing gravitational sweater, knitted out of the non-existing fabric of space-time. Quick note, rule number 3 does not apply to really hot glober or flat earther chicks who want to knit a sweater from the fabric of space-time. That is the only rule which can be bent in regards to rule number 3. In the case where the conditions have been met to allow immunity to rule number 3, immunity is also granted to rules number 1 and 2. We will gladly throw water on any hot chick, glober, or flat earther whom is spinning at any rate, even if she's upside down wearing her sweater knitted of the fabric of space-time. Hey, rules are rules. So, enough said about the rules, and let's get on with it. This video is intended to find the so-called edge of the flat Earth and look at other things too, because we've all been trained to believe we live on an enclosed system with no escape. The very first point to make in this video is that regardless of the map you use, the map isn't actually the Earth. We humans have a propensity, almost to a fault, to think in terms that we can relate to. We want the lowest common denominator, right? So for example, a map has 4 corners, and the sun appears to go in a circuit concentric with the North Pole. Therefore, the world is circle in shape, and the boundaries are circling the square. This is a bit of a leap, as far as I'm concerned. Remember, the latitude and longitude lines are imaginary lines derived strictly from observations of celestial bodies in the sky. We tend to think that our eyesight is 100% accurate filter through which to observe reality, when in fact this is a very misguided assumption. For starters, visible light is such a small sliver of the total spectrum of available frequencies, we're mostly blind in terms of our capacity to interpret visible light only. The same can be said in the audible frequencies. We're mostly deaf, as the subaudible and superaudible frequencies far outnumber the tiny sliver of our audible frequencies spectrum. So, for the most part, we humans are mostly blind and mostly deaf, and yet we believe we can see and hear everything, which, sort of gives us this misguided understanding that we are somehow in tune with all of nature, which we absolutely are not. In a similar sort of naivete, we also tend to think that light must only travel in straight lines based on repeatable observations here on the ground. The truth is, depending on the medium through which light is directed, it can behave in unexpected ways. When you alter the medium through which light waves travel, you can alter the path which the light ultimately takes. Such a medium could be a physical substance, such as a gas or a liquid, or something more exotic, for example, electromagnetic flux lines emanating from the giant capacitor plate we call Earth.
We have electric fields. So let's suppose we have a charged particle here. And I'll put some plus signs in here to represent a nice big positive charge on this object. And I'll use some lines to draw an electric field. And these will be field lines, just like the gravitational field, but this will represent an electric field. And I'm going to draw these lines going out. Electricity can attract or repel. So the field lines could be outward or inward. If this were a negatively charged object, the field lines would be inward. But around a positively charged object, the field lines are outward. And again, the lines give us a way to visualize the field, and they capture certain aspects of the field. And again, we see that the lines are closer together, close to the mass, representing a more intense field, or close to the charge, rather. And as we move away from the charge, the lines spread out, representing the field getting weaker at greater distances. Now the point is this: if there is a charge, then there is an electric field around it. Every charge has an electric field around it. We can say that the electric charge is the source of the electric field, or that the charge produces the field, or that the field is caused by the charge. Now with that in mind, let's talk about a magnetic field. Let's suppose we have a piece of wire with some electric current in it. So here's a wire, and I'm going to draw some little negative signs in here, and these represent electrons moving through the wire. So let's say there's some electrons moving through the wire in that direction. If there's charge moving through the wire, it turns out you get a magnetic field around the wire, and the field lines are going to be drawn as loops going around the wire like this. They're closed loops. Look something like that. And here's the idea: every moving charge has a magnetic field around it. And that's just the way the universe is. Every charge has an electric field, and every moving charge has a magnetic field. And we can draw these field lines to help us visualize the field. So we say that a moving charge is the source of a magnetic field, or that a moving charge produces a magnetic field, or that a magnetic field is caused by a moving charge. That's fundamentally the source of any magnetic field. And this is why the electric current, if you remember Oersted's experiment, he had the electric current flowing through a wire and had a magnetic compass nearby. And when he turned on the circuit and current went through the wire, the compass needle deflected, and he wasn't expecting that. But he noticed it, and he realized that there was this connection between electricity and magnetism. And this is it. Moving electric charge produces a magnetic field.
When you alter the medium through which light waves travel, you can alter the path which the light ultimately takes. Such a medium could be a physical substance, such as a gas or a liquid, or something more exotic, for example, electromagnetic flux lines emanating from the giant capacitor plate we call Earth. Light bending around wildly in different sorts of media is demonstrable in a lab, or even natural given the known observations of refraction causing sunlight to bend over the plane, depending on atmospheric conditions and the time of the season. Let's not forget the ionized plasma tubes in the lower magnetosphere, which tend to or could potentially bend light and create all sorts of illusions in terms of light. The seasons being directly related to the angle at which the light from the sun is passing through our ionosphere and the magnetosphere and even these ionized plasma tubes. It really sort of renders this whole thing, or renders us as observers, sort of biased and incapable of understanding the big picture. If this firmament idea is a non physical or even semi physical medium, for example, peak areas of electromagnetic activity running along the meridian lines north to south, which are generated by the face of the Earth itself, could this explain some of the anomalies found with solar observations? In the lower magnetosphere, again, we have ionized plasma also running parallel to the meridian lines, so it appears we have a pattern here, which could certainly lend itself to a major source of confusion or even a bias for us observers nestled within such protective barriers. For one example, let me just point out that we assume that the meridian lines are straight lines running north to south and perfectly straight lines because it's high noon along all of these points along this line. And so we just naturally assume that that line is a straight line. But if you look at the actual time zones on a map, they bend around wildly. And they say it's because they don't want to cross states or counties. But what I'm saying is that it's possible that the sunlight, as it passes along these meridian lines, or these actual meridian lines as opposed to the imaginary straight meridian lines, but this sunlight could possibly be passing through curved meridian lines, which would, here on the ground, would give us the illusion that all of these points along this curved line are on a straight line, when in fact it could look something more like a yin and yang symbol. And I've seen models like that. I'll try to find an animation of that. But that makes sense. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the meridian lines are necessarily that curved, but what I'm saying is that anything's possible, and even something as exotic as the southern hemisphere light from the astral plane, or these meridian lines in the southern hemisphere appearing to even converge back towards a point towards the south. But just because the light in the sky converges back towards a point doesn't necessarily mean that the ground itself does. And so that's the sort of thing that I mean, that we can't necessarily ascribe the path of the stars and the path of the sun to our world. Because, again, just say meridian lines are not actually straight. We just assume that they're straight because, point X, Y, and Z all experience noon at the same time. But what if that is a curved line and we have no way of knowing other than our observations of the sun? And so, certainly we can do surveying on the ground levels, but, the survey data sort of goes by assumptions of latitude and longitude, which again are directly related to observations of the sun and the stars. And so it's all sort of this self-feeding, self-sufficient downward spiral of, checks and balances that are all built upon a fallacious assumption, or so it would appear. If the light from the sun is naturally propagating along its path of least resistance, for lack of a better phrase, the path most conducive to its northerly propagation, it's that sort of strange behavior of light that appears to be causing confusion for us little observers here on the ground, well within a series of metaphysical lenses. The magnetic flux lines and ionized plasma tubes and different layers of atmosphere appear to be jutting north and south along these lines, especially due to the electromagnetic patterns. And this creates the conditions of high noon across all points along the same meridian line. However, such east to west flux lines are not nearly as prevalent, except perhaps closer to the area involved with the southern summer solstice. At any rate, if the sunlight is actually traveling across these semi-physical lines more readily going north to south than it does east to west, it makes sense that observers spotting the sun who are positioned across the same meridian line will have or could have conflicting estimations of the apparent location of the sun. But this same principle explains how it's 12 o'clock noon at the same time along all points on the same meridian line, but midnight on the opposite end of the map or the opposite meridian line, or at least midnight on the opposite end of the sun's apparent circuit above and along the face of the Earth. If the Earth itself is behaving like a giant capacitor plate, as postulated by Nikola Tesla, and the ionosphere is acting as the other plate to complete the connection or the circuit, we definitely have a bubble shaped magnetic field which would look like the top half of a donut, with the North Pole being directly in the center. So we're sort of describing a toroidal shape, and the 90-degree latitude line would be all points along the inside edge of that donut, or the inside edge of that torus. If you can imagine such a magnetic field engulfing the entire flat Earth, the size and scope of the field would be mind-boggling. If such ionized plasma and layers of atmosphere act like a lens or a series of lenses, it's sufficient to refer to such a lens as a dome, without any, insinuation of a physical object or firm, tangible substance, such as glass or iron, constituting such a dome. While the latitude and longitude lines are imaginary lines based on celestial observations, the barrier which appears to divide the physical plane from the celestial realm seems to possess both physical and non-physical properties. Physical properties in a sense that it compels light to behave in unfamiliar ways, and non-physical properties in a sense that ionized plasma and or electromagnetic fields are sort of exotic states of matter or energy, making it difficult to relate to anything we are familiar with in our regular lives. At least the ionized plasma and electromagnetic fields can be demonstrated in reality, unlike the theory of gravity and the theory of spacetime, which only exists in the minds of the delusional cult members indoctrinated in the religion of scientism, and only exists in the invisible sweaters knitted by the hot flat earther chicks with the fabric of spacetime. Not to bore everyone with the details, but a lot of researchers are finding themselves confounded with observations of the sun, which is exactly the sort of behavior I'm describing with this theory of the sun possibly involving a distant, unseen light source, as opposed to the apparent visible sun, which could be two totally separate things. In other words, if the source of the light from the sun is far removed and unseen from the area above the earth where we reckon the sun to be, extreme apparent distances could be traversed nearly instantaneously by the apparent sun, simply because what we reckon the sun to be is merely a symptom or a phantom of a far removed light source reacting with our magnetosphere and ionosphere. For example, if you shine a projector on a wall from 20 feet away, if you nudge the projector 45 degrees instantly, the projection will travel across the wall at a high rate of speed. However, the source of light only moved a short distance. I've done very generic demonstration of the principle I'm referring to, which essentially states that while we exist on the ground, we possibly exist in a lens of sorts. It's also important to mention that when light passes through lenses, it can be completely inverted, which is why often when you set things in a projector, you set them in there upside down because the light is inverted when it hits a mirror. Same thing when you use a magnifying glass. Light is inverted at different positions relative to the magnifying glass. Entire images are inverted. So the atmosphere and the ionosphere can certainly act as a whole on the macro scale like a giant series of lenses, which could cause the light from the sun to separate or render into the visible spectrum, but it could also cause the light from the sun to do unexpected things. The point in our magnetic fusion plasma separating the physical plane from the heavens, where a possibly distant source of light penetrates that barrier, the light from the sun is separated into the visible spectrum much like light hitting a prism. In this scenario, a distant unseen source of light is rendered as visible and appears to propagate more readily north to south, naturally following along with the magnetic field lines, naturally following along with the ionized plasma tubes, in a north to south fashion in accordance with the imaginary lines known as the meridian lines. Or should I say, the meridian lines fall into accordance with the visible light from the sun traversing the existing flux lines running between the north and south areas, just like any other EM field. So, in other words, the meridial lines, the latitude and the longitude lines, are imaginary lines that followed the observations of celestial bodies. The celestial bodies do not adhere to the imaginary lines that we created. Of course, the amazing magnitude of the sun's brightness causes the local atmosphere to become excited in such a way and to glow a bright blue like a sapphire, the light from the apparent sun spreading out in all directions along the dome shaped magnetic field more readily towards north to south, naturally adhering to the existing energy lines emanating from the Earth. The light also appears to be expanding out in all directions as it passes through our conductive atmosphere, which also acts as a perfect medium for the visible spectrum of light to jut out in all directions from the apparent source of light. Now, I should define what I mean by the actual source and apparent source of light in terms of the sun. The actual source of light in this hypothesis is unknown, which means it could be coming from any point above the atmosphere and magnetosphere up in the heavens facing down towards the Earth, or it could be generated from the Earth itself. For example, there could be an unknown source of invisible radio waves or invisible light waves emanating from the very center of the map or the center of that torus. It's known as Mount Meru or maybe Mount Olympus or maybe Atlantis in ancient cultures. Now, I'm not saying this is the case, but anything is possible, and this is just a hypothesis. Now, we assume that the source of light from the sun is exactly where we reckon the sun to be, but if you study light, the source of the sun's brilliant light could be someplace far removed, where you would never reckon it to be. At this point, it's irrelevant. However, it's important that the viewer understand that the source of light might be something far removed from where the sun appears to be, and the original source of the light may not even exist in the visible spectrum. The point is, when the true source of light comes into contact with our metaphysical bubble, which is apparently a mesh of electromagnetic fields and flux lines and ionized plasma tubes and atmosphere, with the flux lines and plasma tubes running north to south, emanating from the center of the map or the North Pole, such behavior of light would adequately explain many anomalies with the conventional flat Earth map and model, as the apparent sun is not bound by any sort of physical laws that would be attributed to a physical object that is allegedly the sun. This model aligns very nicely with Drew 777777's compilation of a year's worth of observations and date time information to show how the light from the sun does not behave in a spotlight down sort of fashion, but instead the light from the sun appears to travel across the path of least resistance, essentially piggybacking on the existing magnetic flow tendencies already in place depending on the time of year and the angle at which the actual source of light is contacting our electromagnetic ionized plasma layers above the face of the Earth, far removed from the physical laws we're familiar with, since all of our previous heliocentric assumptions about the universe are obviously a fallacy. This sort of hypothesis is much, much more logical and possible than anything involving a spinning globe Earth. At any rate, this notion that the apparent sun is not necessarily the source of light, but possibly a sort of ghost or phantom or even a reflection of the actual source, this hypothesis fits very nicely into the idea that instead of the physical sun 3,500 miles into the air making a seasonal path from Capricorn to Cancer and back, accelerating as it travels south and decelerating as it travels north to ensure a 24-hour day all year long, we could actually have an unknown light source which is, for all intents and purposes, stationary or possibly simply pivoting, but vortex conditions that are emanating from the center of the map cause the appearance of all things spinning in the celestial plane. That could include even the stars appearing to spin because of this light source emanating from the center and being affected by this sort of vortex pattern that is electromagnetic fields. If you can imagine a high density, possibly superconductive source of immense electromagnetic capacity at the very center of the flat Earth, creating a powerful electromagnetic vortex which creates the power supply for the entire system, and I believe that's what Nikola Tesla was tapping into, but all of this emanating from the non-visible frequencies which somehow triangulate on the specific point in space and time that you would reckon to be the sun, for example. Now, these electromagnetic vortex patterns would be emanating from the very center, pointing up and always traversing south towards the equator along these existing or along these electromagnetic tendency lines, while the angle of attack, which this light source is clashing with our electromagnetic field, is changing throughout the year, and it's causing the light from the apparent sun to behave differently depending on the time of year, and causing the apparent location of the sun to change throughout the year. So instead of a physical object making ever changing in radius laps around the North Pole, perhaps the actual light source is a stationary point directly in the center of the donut, and the vortex patterns caused by the immense electromagnetic field in the north act as sort of a disco ball, one hell of a disco ball, and all of the celestial spectacles are merely illusions created by a massive electromagnetic anomaly emanating from the North Pole. Now, I'm not saying this hypothesis is necessarily true, but again, to be very honest, it makes more sense to me than the idea that the sun is accelerating in the southern summer and decelerating in the northern summer. Maybe that's what it's doing. I'm just sort of trying to think outside of the box here because we know for sure that light is not a rectilinear constant, just like so-called space-time is not a rectilinear constant, but instead is a theoretical fantasy dreamed up by a dude named Albert Schilstein. Now, I realize it's difficult to try and wrap your brain around the idea of a non physical sun and apparent light source versus actual light source, but when you play around with the idea in practical applications of light, it becomes a little bit more easy to understand, and such an idea becomes more and more possible the more you study light and how it behaves in different media. Observations of the sun are obviously a great way to aid us in navigation and mapping. However, if the light from a distant unseen source is naturally bent towards a meridional path and less frequently bent towards a latitudinal path or around the sides, then it appears that much of the assumptions which originally aid the construction of the Mercator projection are not necessarily sturdy pillars of assumptions to rest the matrix of the map on forever. Now, beyond all of this, I can envision a dividing line at the equator in the layers of lenses above us, which could certainly invert the incoming light waves, which could cause all sorts of confusion in terms of navigating in the southern hemisphere, which has always been the case. The far southern regions have long been a mystery to even the famous captains of old, who could never seem to conquer the southern region in terms of complete circumnavigation, and they've only estimated degrees of longitude in the southern hemisphere and only estimated them, never actually measured them, and certainly never circumnavigated the far southern hemisphere. Now, even the most experienced manual navigators would find themselves far removed from their reckoning in the south, using the very charts and maps and observations that they can typically count on like a charm in the northern hemisphere. Now, early into my journey as a flat earther, I considered the atmosphere and other such layers above us as sort of lenses which could cause a complete inversion depending on the observer's position relative to the lens. So, if you humor this theory for a moment, if you can imagine the equator line being an arbitrary sector of the astral lenses, which on either side of that point inverts certain elements of the image rendered into the sky, whatever source of light is causing the stars, for example. It doesn't matter if that stuff's being inverted, then we're going to have issues as observers here on the ground looking up from within this series of lenses. The more I study the stars, the more I doubt that they are anything physical for reasons that I've mentioned previously. But just to recap, for one, we cannot see the stars during the day, even though we can see the moon during the day. If the stars were actually little suns, then you'd think they would be able to see them during the day, but okay, that's sort of besides the point. Number two, we can't see the stars from high altitude weather balloon footage, even, apparently at night. Now, granted, weather balloon launching is illegal at night, but when you get above a certain altitude, you can see the blue atmosphere beneath you. The sun is always just a few degrees above the horizon, apparently, and the blackness of space, even if it's not an exposure issue, even if none of the rest of the Earth or the sun is in the picture, you never see any stars. Now, number 3, we can't see stars from the International Space Station footage either. Any stars or street lights or lightning flashes are added in later as a special effect. However, I can assure you that the supposedly real images of low Earth orbit, which are most certainly indistinguishable from high altitude flight, will never show any stars in real time. Number 4, the only time we can see stars is if we're standing on the ground and the sun is nowhere near you. You can begin to see stars during the twilight hours, which proves the points that sunlight travels much further along meridian lines than it does along lines of latitudes under most circumstances.
No stars. Okay, so that was the first tip off, and so then
But you can see the Earth.
you can see light reflected off of objects. Okay, as we look in this space, we say this place is filled with light. We do not see any lines of light between us. We only see what is illuminated by the light, what the light reflects off of.
Yeah.
We do not see the light itself. Here, you see that laser beam?
Right.
No, you don't see the laser beam. You see the laser beam? No, it's because it's off. Boy,
Right every time.
that worked every time, man. Okay, you can see where the. Okay, between you and me. No, it's not there. You cannot see light. Okay, it's really important to understand this.
Sometimes you can see it. Oh, that's right. You see the dust.
You see the dust particles, right? You see only what light reflects off of. So when you actually look at a source in outer space, it is not transmitted. Light is not transmitted in the visible spectrum in outer space. Period.
So then, how would the Hubble telescope take
It will blind you, but you can't see it.
Hubble
They do need those damn
So basically,
gold reflectors. But you can look straight at the sun, not see anything, and you're blind. It is not visible.
the word telescope has to have some kind of lens where light
It
reflects
needs
off.
a diffraction lens. Okay, what really sealed the deal for Tom Brown in his research is he found one of those coffee table, 18 by 24, coffee table things, that cost $500. It had 400 pages in it, 5,000 photographs of the sun. It was shown in every spectrum, gamma rays and infrared, and X-rays, you name it. There were in that book, put out by NASA as like the definitive study of the sun. There was not one single photograph in the book of the sun in the visible spectrum. None.
It was taken from outer space.
Taken from outer space. Right. What you see is the refraction of the sun in the upper atmosphere. That's all you see. That is not what it looks like. And the minute you get out of the atmosphere, you got no reflection between you and that. Can't see it.
So, in other words, even though the sun is setting for you, and it's only a few degrees in longitude away from you to the west, that same sun is lighting up the entire north to south meridian line, making it, high noon across a very vast distance where that sunlight is not traveling as far laterally, if that makes sense. Number 5, for some reason, when the sun is anywhere in the picture, regardless of altitude, of the observer, no stars are visible. Regardless of altitude, even in total darkness from the ISS feed or from high altitude weather balloon footage, no stars are visible. Number 6, all of the supposed moon landing shots show no visible stars, and when the astronauts were asked about how the stars looked from the moon, they couldn't recall. Number 7, NASA absolutely adds stars and lightning and streetlights from the cities later on from the ISS footage, but during all of the live feed that you'll ever see, any light except that of their backlit stage lights and the front lit Earth, which appears to be trick photography using high altitude flight combined with computer graphics, you're lucky to get 15 to 30 minutes of live feed for any hour of the so-called 24-hour live feed of the ISS. And we just hand NASA nearly $20 billion every year to play with water in space and to do backflips in space and to brush their hair in space and to play with objects and spin them around in space, but never seem to accomplish anything in space.
Lab Kibo. So Koichi, walk me through what you're working on in this lab.
Yeah, this is an experiment called Spheres. And these satellite robots are specifically designed to function in the microgravity. They contain the software that the scientists are testing.
At first, this looks like a full motion scene to me, but on closer inspection, I think this is a suspended mode scene. When it's sped up, you can kind of see them swinging, and it has the same backdrop as the other suspended mode scenes.
NASA and everything they accomplish or fail to accomplish is a business interest for every American taxpayer and really for every world taxpayer living in countries involved with the International Space Station. Now let's get something straight. There are no materials known to man that could survive the alleged temperatures claimed to exist in the thermosphere where the ISS is supposedly zipping around at 20,000 miles an hour. Now, it isn't just the temperature that's the issue for all materials known to man, but it's the temperature flux that is such an insurmountable problem for any mechanical engineer or materials scientist in reality. Now, for example, the ISS supposedly goes from the day side of the Earth to the night side of the Earth very frequently, many times a day. And the change in temperature from day to night when you travel beyond the protective layers of our atmosphere somehow are not a problem for the ISS. They have somehow solved a major problem, a physical problem that befalls all mechanical structures exposed to major changes in temperature, especially if we're talking about simple things such as seals, valves, gaskets, even the very metal which the ship is supposedly built of should turn to liquid during the day or gas during the day and should freeze beyond well below its breaking point during the night. But all of these little seals and valves and gaskets would constantly need changing due to this flux of expanding and contracting due to temperature flux, and they would constantly be breaking down. Now, it's impossible for conventional sealing methods to work in a vacuum environment in the first place, as you need what's called back pressure in order for any type of sealant or gasket or airtight connection to work for conjoining segments. Now, with all this being said, there's supposedly a never-ending barrage, a shotgun blast coming from all directions of space, which is junk and little meteoroids, even pebble-sized or sand-sized meteoroids, all over the place up there, shooting around at high velocities, unseen, uncharted, unknown. However, the ISS, in its 15 years up there in low Earth orbit, in the thermosphere, has never had one single instance of even a pebble-sized meteoroid or space junk colliding with it at supersonic speeds, possibly approaching 50,000 miles per hour or greater, depending on the velocity of the projectile versus the velocity of the ISS. There are some very lucky astronauts up there in La La Land. However, you'll notice that NASA has a strict policy of never closing hatches between segments. Now, we'll get back to this in a second, but all of these issues that NASA has apparently solved in terms of materials, in terms of sealing up things in space to be airtight, even though airtight seals don't work in a vacuum environment, what sort of technological advances has NASA come up with that allows for any sort of material not to experience major expansion and contraction when you've got extreme fluxes in temperature? So all of these problems that NASA has been solving has been on our dime as the taxpayer, and yet where is the technology? Where are the patents that we should all be getting a share of the profits from? Where are the benefits to mankind? Where are all these major technological advances that would necessarily come out of NASA's 15-year adventure in the ISS, doing backflips and playing with water and spinning objects around in their fingers and going outside to do spacewalks? But where is this technology? Where is the return on our investment? We've been spending $20 billion a year on NASA for decades. I believe the overall budget for the ISS is $500 billion over its life. And we have nothing to show for it but sweaty jock straps, Tang, the microwave, which was probably not invented in space, and what do we have? We've got films. We've got moon landing films, which, by the way, they lost 700 boxes of footage. And so, as a taxpayer, as an investor in NASA, as an investor in deep space exploration, where's the return on our investment? So, with that being said, NASA has some lucky astronauts because the ISS has never even been struck by a single pebble, which we see shooting stars all the time. There's supposed to be space junk flying around up there due to all the satellites that have crashed and the little bits and pieces continue to orbit. But never have we seen one single incident on the ISS. Now, the entire ISS appears to be built from segments that do not even have hatches between the segments. Try to find one. Try to find them flying around through the ISS, which is strikingly similar to a jet, a big, jumbo jet that's just fitted with really generic light stuff to make it look like the inside of an ISS.
Buddy, what are you doing? Is that a treadmill you're on with a pair of scissors on it? Absolutely. Look, you need some safety boots, and you need some eye protection. I don't know what you think you're doing. Where is your fire extinguisher in here? And why is that hatch open? You didn't ever work on a submarine, did you? I didn't think so. Hey, fella. What are you doing? I'm Jeff. I'm the new safety guy, OSHA guy. And I'm here. What is this? Why are you barefooted up here? Are those OSHA approved glasses? And why is that door open? Man, look, I'm gonna have to call a whole meeting. I want you to go get all of your friends on this space station. You have them all down here in about 5 minutes. I need to talk to all of you.
The extended mode is much quieter than the full motion mode. In full motion mode, you can actually hear the sound of the jet engines, the engines of the airplane. In every single scene of full motion mode, in every segment of the International Space Station, you can hear this loud sound, the sound of the jet engines. You could argue that it's the air conditioning system. Not even an office air conditioner is that loud. And why is there a loud sound in every segment of the International Space Station? That's because no matter how soundproof you make it, you can't filter out all of the sound of the jet engines. An airplane is just too noisy. You can put noise-cancelling headphones on when you're on a plane, and that doesn't stop the sound from getting through. It muffles it. They also use microphones that don't pick up very far away. If you have a look at this scene here, you can see that when the microphone's in the middle, pointing towards the guy in the middle, you can't hear the sound of jet engines as much, but when the microphone goes to the guy on the side, you can hear the sound of jet engines a bit more. So you can't truly soundproof the inside of the airplane where they fake full motion mode. You can see in this scene from the recent National Geographic documentary Live from Space, Koichi Wakata is looking at the window there. This is full motion mode, and you can tell because of the sound of jet engines. In quiet mode, they can go to the copula and they can look through at their model, and you can see an amazing model. Gee, why would you build the International Space Station out of a bunch of long, thin segments that can easily break at the joints? So there's their fairly realistic view of the rest of the International Space Station. The International Space Station was made piecemeal. They started off with one section and then they added another section, another section. It consists of a bunch of tubular sections which are joined together. It's an ad hoc design. Here are a few scenes from the tour of the International Space Station that they take you on. And I noticed that there's no airlock between sections. This means if there's an air leak in one section, they will be affected in all sections. They're quite likely to all die.
But they never have hatches between these segments, I guess because all those steel hatches would weigh down the jumbo jet too much. But this is basically a suicide waiting to happen. And if they're actually in space, as they claim to be, these people must be terminally ill, and so they're suicidal, and they just don't care if they die. Now, it's imperative that you realize that submarines and ships are built with airlocking hatches between segments, because if you spring a leak in one segment, you want to contain that leak to the single section of your ship, as opposed to allowing the entire ship to become overflown by water and sunk. Now, in the case of the ISS, we're not talking about a little bit of water leaking into a pebble-sized hole. We're talking about the infinite vacuum of space in the heliocentric model, according to them. This means that if one single pebble hit the ISS at a point in the giant lanky structure, this giant lanky asteroid magnet, the ISS, everything not fastly secured to the hole would instantly be sucked out of the hole, which is the size of a pebble, or would begin as the size of a pebble. Now, what would happen is the first astronaut, probably with his smile still plastered on his face, is sucked towards that hole. The hole would start to stretch out to allow for the pressure differential to suck him out into the infinite vacuum of space, at which point the hole would be much, much bigger. And within just a few seconds, maybe a fraction of a second, every last astronaut and every bag of jelly beans and every drop of water and every laptop and every toy that they play with up there, yeah, even their little pee tubes would be sucked out into the vacuum of space at breakneck speeds, at which point the ISS would expand in all directions and fall to the Earth, a flaming show of NASA's failing to close their hatches, which don't exist, within an instant. Now, this is just a single pebble traveling at a velocity contrary to that of the ISS at orbital velocities. There wouldn't be time to bail out the vacuum of infinite space out of the deck like you could a ship or a submarine if you could surface. The pressurized ISS would immediately be evacuated. And I don't mean them jumping into the Soyuz and evacuating. I mean all of the matter, all of the stuff, all of the astronauts would be evacuated out of that hole, sucking everyone and everything out of that pebble-sized hole, which grows to be, the largest object that was sucked through its sized hole, segment by segment in rapid succession until every last compartment that was not sealed off would be totally void of everything that was not nailed down.
Mother of God, no! Oh shit! Come on, run! Come on! What happened?
Are we supposed to fly that close to the mountains?
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, blessed is the fruit of thy womb.
Let's see what we can find. Everything seems to be tied down all right. That doesn't look bad. Uh-oh. Look at there. Another open hatch. Somebody done walked out of this compartment or floated out of this compartment and left the door open. Ain't that something? You ain't never gonna learn up here. Hey, ain't nobody in here either. Hello? Anybody in here? No? Well, let's see what we can find. I don't see no fire suppressant protection equipment. And all this stuff floating around up here just looks like a fire hazard waiting to happen. And uh-oh, another open door. Must be the same guy that went out of that last compartment. Ha! These guys. Let's see what we got here. Oh, little hallway looking thing. I don't see. Look, shit floating around. Laptops with batteries in them. And uh-oh, another open hatch. Man. Hey, fella, what you doing? Yeah, well, where's your safety goggles at? Where's your gloves at? You know, down on Earth, they gotta be outfitted in Tyvek suits and rubber gloves and these little skin hats. And how come hey man, why's that hatch open? Did you leave that hatch open? Ha! What's your name, son? I want you to go down there and meet me down there in about 10 minutes with all the other fellas on this place.
Now, if the astronauts valued their lives and observed safety rules, they would be extremely strict about closing the hatches between segments, which don't exist because there's no way for them to seal off a hull breach. That's just stuff for the movies. Now, if they all kept their hatches closed at all times, a single pebble breaching the hull would be contained, and they could sally port, an astronaut into the breached section. So in other words, they could put an astronaut in an adjacent section, seal off that section, evacuate all of the pressure out of that section slowly, and then open the hatch between that section and the breach section, allow the astronaut into the breach section, seal that back off behind him. Then he could begin to work on sealing that off and repressurizing the section that had been breached. So that's what I mean by sally port him in. You don't just open up the gate and allow everyone to die. Now, if they kept all their hatches closed at all times, the single pebble would be contained, and they could fix it, and they'd all live. But nope, not NASA. They have a rule never to close a hatch. And in fact, when they sleep, the doors on their bunks are reminiscent of the bathroom doors on an airplane. And we're not talking about first class either. We're talking about a plastic little door, so even as they slept, if a single pebble hit the ISS in any section, doesn't matter which, because they never close their hatches, they'd all be sucked out into infinite space through the hole the size of a pebble while they sleep. Now, in fact, the ISS has all sorts of qualities similar to an airplane, especially the jet engine noises you can hear in the background of most of their little tours around the ISS, which are supposed to prove they're in space, but only prove that they are liars.
The extended mode is much quieter than the full motion mode. In full motion mode, you can actually hear the sound of the jet engines, the engines of the airplane. In every single scene of full motion mode, in every segment of the International Space Station, you can hear this loud sound, the sound of the jet engines. You could argue that it's the air conditioning system. Not even an office air conditioner is that loud. And why is there a loud sound in every segment of the International Space Station? That's because no matter how soundproof you make it, you can't filter out all of the sound of the jet engines. An airplane is just too noisy. You can put noise-cancelling headphones on when you're on a plane, and that doesn't stop the sound from getting through. It muffles it. They also use microphones that don't pick up very far away. If you have a look at this scene here, you can see that when the microphone's in the middle, pointing towards the guy in the middle, you can't hear the sound of jet engines as much, but when the microphone goes to the guy on the side, you can hear the sound of jet engines a bit more. So you can't truly soundproof the inside of the airplane where they fake full motion mode. You can see in this scene from the recent National Geographic documentary Live from Space, Koichi Wakata is looking at the window there. This is full motion mode, and you can tell because of the sound of jet engines. in quiet mode, they can go to the
stop here just
copula
for a
and they
quick
can look through at their model. And you can see an amazing model. Gee, why would you build the International Space Station out of a bunch of long, thin segments that can easily break at the joints? So there's their fairly realistic view of the rest of the International Space Station.
Whenever we study high-altitude weather balloon footage, we notice the black sky above the bright blue atmosphere is always devoid of stars. Now, this lends credence to the possibility that a distant, true source of light, causing the sunlight which clashes with our atmosphere and electromagnetic field, and by some natural process of reflection and refraction, is separated or rendered into the visible spectrum, and propagates in all directions for the apparent source of light, and especially tends towards north to south in accordance with the electromagnetic flux lines and imaginary meridian lines on a map. So in other words, the light from the apparent sun follows north and south more readily than laterally and under most normal circumstances. Again, in this case, the seasons could be caused merely by the true source of light's angle of attack upon our atmosphere slowly changing over the course of a year, and therefore the apparent sun doesn't face the issue of accelerating during the southern summer and decelerating during the northern summer, because the true, hidden, unknown source of light could actually be stationary, merely pivoting around a central magnetic vortex. In any case, the atmosphere is indeed acting as sort of a lens. Not only could a distant unseen light source appear to do all sorts of wild things according to us, there could be a very simple explanation which is beyond our capacity to fully understand or prove at any rate. Indeed, I think it's safe to assume that certain portions of reality will never be fully explained until maybe we're able to abolish the Antarctic Treaty, which, by the way, I did set up a petition for the Sovereign Peoples Movement to abolish the Arctic and Antarctic treaties. I'll put a link in the description. I urge everyone to sign. You can do so anonymously. You don't have to put your name down, but the goal is to get 100,000 signatures by the end of 2016. So, at any rate, I think it's safe to assume that certain portions of reality will never be explained fully, which is why I believe people working with NASA were able to convince themselves to hoax the world. Perhaps they were just too haughty to simply admit the world isn't a spinning globe, and we're really not sure what the hell's the sun's doing. Apparently, the sun can be observed by multiple people on a similar meridian line. However, when you calculate the position and angle at which the sun appears, the evidence seems to indicate multiple suns. Now, I highly doubt there are multiple suns. However, I find it extremely possible in the model that I've been describing here in this video for such observers on disparate points upon a similar meridian to apparently see the sun at multiple apparent points simultaneously, when the fact is they're seeing different manifestations of the same unknown or unseen light source, apparently as separate entities or separate manifestations, when in fact this appears to be an optical illusion supported by the evidence covered so far in this video. Now, this only lends credence to my argument that the true source of light and the apparent location of the sun could be far removed from one another, as the visible apparent sun could be reflective or indicative of a distant, unseen electromagnetic source, which is exclusive or even transcendent of any apparent location of the sun. The laws of perspective also play into this equation, as we on the ground are only capable of taking in a small amount of reality here on the physical plane, and the furthest we can see is, off towards the horizon parallel to the ground is the horizon. That's just depending on how tall you are, and usually it's about 3.5 miles if there is no topography. So if you're looking out to the ocean and you're 6 feet tall, the horizon's about 3.5 miles away. If you're on the top of a cliff looking out towards the ocean, then the horizon could be much, much further than that, it's just depending on how tall is the cliff. So during a clear night, you can see the stars directly above the horizon over a still ocean. Now, does that mean the stars, which are apparently directly near the horizon, are actually about to touch the horizon? Or does this indicate that the stars are on a far removed plane, adhering to the laws of perspective so that distant stars appear to drop lower and lower towards the horizon until the vanishing point on the ground obscures our view of any stars further beyond that point? Often, flat earth domers will use this observation to support the theory of a glass dome in the sky. However, the stars near the horizon are essentially in the same plane as the stars directly overhead. However, due to the laws of perspective, the distant stars will gradually drop lower towards the horizon, directly proportionate to distance from the observer. When the sun sets, it's traveling across the same apparent plane the entire time. However, due to the principles involving the behavior of light mentioned previously, coupled with the laws of perspective, the sun appears to drop beneath the plane which the sun traverses is many miles above the horizon, but it appears to drop beneath the plane. While the visible distance to the sky is much further than the visible distance on the ground, the sun's curved light waves are obscured by the horizon line long before the sun reaches anything close to its apparent vanishing point from your perspective, especially considering the atmosphere indeed behaves as sort of a lens, and so the sun could possibly be magnified as it approaches its vanishing point, but is obscured by the horizon long before it actually reaches its vanishing point. In other words, the stars near the horizon are not lower than the other stars. However, they are so distant that the laws of perspective and the curved nature of our metaphysical barrier causes the optical illusion that such a distant star is near the horizon, when in reality it's possibly thousands of miles above and beyond that point where you reckon it is. We can clearly demonstrate that light waves will behave in unexpected ways when traveling through and around different sorts of medium, including electromagnetic fields, liquids, and certainly ionized plasma, which does exist in the meridional tubes oriented north to south in the lower magnetosphere. And so many anomalies surrounding the sun as a metaphysical object that we believe must be where we see or reckon it is, or even triangulate it to be based on these observations, can really not be argued as proof of anything but our observational bias and inherent imperfections in our ability to accurately observe a true source of light, which we confuse with the apparent position of the sun, which is only light waves passing through all of these different sorts of media. The observations of the sun become more and more interesting when you consider our ability to decipher the behavior of a distant, possibly unseen, true light source passing through a series of metaphysical lenses is inherently biased and really cannot be taken at face value, especially in terms of calculations involving distance to and velocity of the sun. We need to study the behavior of light propagating via electromagnetic flux lines or even ionized plasma tubes under controlled conditions. However, right now I can go with what I've got and look at lasers bending through water, for one example. If lasers can bend around and through water and light can be separated through a prism, then why couldn't the light from the sun be simply symptomatic of an unseen stimuli or an unseen source? Why must we assume that the sunlight acts as a spotlight down to the face of the earth when there's so much evidence to support the notion that light from the sun is a phantom or is biased in its regular course of travel, tending to propagate more easily via the meridional lines, and only under certain circumstances during the southern summer solstice does the sunlight appear to behave in a similar manner, traversing the outermost latitude lines. It has been raised quite a bit lately that the Antarctic is at the end of the world, and beyond that there is nothing else, like the edge of a cliff. Now, this might be the case, however, I have yet to find even a shred of evidence to support this position, and even people that support the position that the edge of Antarctica is the edge of the world will tell you they can't prove it. However, I believe that there is good evidence showing the contrary. During the past 8 months or so, I've become a very avid watcher of high-altitude weather balloon footage, which has become more and more interesting and intriguing as the months advance. One thing I've certainly noticed during all high-altitude weather balloon footage is that the horizon remains at eye level and an equidistant circle all the way around the observer. Unfortunately for the idea that the Antarctic is the end of the world, I have never paid much attention to the hemisphere which the balloons were all launched in, but I do seem to remember a few from Australia, which is certainly in the southern hemisphere. In any case, during all of the weather balloon launches that I've watched, never have I witnessed a situation where the horizon is at eye level on one direction and quickly falls towards a crescent shape looking in the opposite direction, which would obviously obviously be south if the world just stops somewhere past the southern region, which would necessarily occur in the event that the world had an edge beyond the outermost path of the apparent sun in southern summertime. In fact, I submit that the imaginary line described by the apparent sun is irrelevant in any sense other than constructing the imaginary latitude and longitude lines due to the nature of light passing more easily from north to south, due to the magnetic and ionized plasma orientation emanating from north to south. Obviously, the latitude lines are imaginary lines dictated by the apparent sun's alleged journey from Capricorn to Cancer and back. However, those are imaginary lines, and the actual source of light might be orbiting in an equal circuit around the North Pole, just as all the visible stars do. For all we know, the distant unknown source of light could very well be emanating from the ground within the 90-degree north latitude, transmitting a vast bandwidth of frequencies up the magnetic vortex in the center, radiating up and out along the meridian lines, and reflecting back down through the existing flux lines and ionized plasma tubes mentioned previously. And there's, could be some relationship between all of this energy release and the sun itself. In some respects, light needs a circuit of sorts in order to be detectable to people. Now, for one thing, the waveform must fall within the visible spectrum, but even the visible spectrum light is invisible without something to reflect the light towards your eye. So if you're outside on a clear light, shine a flashlight or a laser pointer, assuming there's no fog or humidity in the air, you're not going to see the beam of light, but instead you'll only see the light reflecting on whatever object it hits. That object could be a molecule of water vapor or steam in the air, or it could be a brick wall, but the fact is you cannot view light without light first reflecting off something and reaching your eye. On the flip side of this circuit, if you stand in a completely dark room with no lights anywhere near you, you cannot see any of the objects in your room, even if they're very close. Now, if you light a small torch or a flashlight, you'll notice that even a small amount of light will bounce around and light up different parts of the room that are not necessarily directly affected by the path of the light, especially if you give your eyes a chance to adjust. The point to this is to illustrate how light is often misunderstood in so many ways. Another example is the heat from the sun. The sun doesn't actually produce heat. It merely produces light, or apparently reflects or separates light, and when that light passes through our atmosphere, it excites the environment, and the light energy is converted to heat energy by a natural process described as the conservation of energy. The sun is certainly a big mystery, but I think with some of this information in play, with more people looking into the topic more seriously, we're getting closer to having a map reasonable to work with. On the other hand, if you would like to help expedite the process, please sign the Sovereign People's Movement to Abolish the Antarctic Treaties. I'll put a link in the descripts, but if we can get enough momentum behind that, perhaps we can make some real headway in the near future. If you study any map, you'll notice that there are 180 degrees west and 180 degrees east. However, you'll only find 90 degrees north and 90 degrees south. People will argue this is because of how the maps are made, but ask yourself, why are maps made that way? There's a specific matrix to cartography that we, for some reason, must be bound to, when in fact the grid upon which we place our relative destinations is inherently flawed in all maps, even on the globes. If you don't believe me, go ask any mainstream cartographer whether he or she believes we have any maps or globes which accurately depict the face of the Earth. If you don't believe me, go ask any mainstream cartographer whether he or she believes we have any maps or globes which accurately depict the face of the Earth. And if they are honest, true cartographers, they will uniformly admit that none of our maps are accurate depictions of the face of the Earth, but of course they will work in terms of navigation as they are designed to work using the imaginary lines indicated by the path of the sun and stars known as latitude and longitude lines. Now, I'm convinced that one big problem with our maps is that the 90-degree north latitude is not a single point, but is instead a ring representative of the inner ring of a magnetic field, or the inner ring of a donut, or the inner ring of a torus, or a toroidal vortex field. And I found this interesting little factoid, just hilarious to the people out there who claim that the maps have never been altered and they're always, correct as long as they work navigationally. I'm just going to read a bit from Wiki regarding cartographic errors. Quote, some maps contain deliberate errors or distortions either as propaganda or as a watermark to help the copyright owner identify infringement if the error appears on competitors' maps. The latter often come in the form of non existent, misnamed, or misspelled tap streets. Other names and forms of this are paper town sites or fictitious entries and copyright Easter eggs. Another motive for deliberate errors is cartographic vandalism, a map maker wishing to leave his or her mark on the work. Mount Richard, for example, was a fictitious peak on the Rocky Mountains Continental Divide that appeared on a Boulder County, Colorado map in the early 1970s. It is believed to be the work of draftsman Richard Siassi. The fiction was not discovered until 2 years later. Sandy Island, New Caledonia, is an example of a fictitious location that stubbornly survives, reappearing on new maps copied from older maps while being deleted from other new editions. So it really just goes to show that cartography is not quite as scientific and accurate as we tend to think it is, and indeed, egos and deliberate misunderstandings are inserted into maps sort of as a trick of the trade or as a signature of the trade. And I submit that the Mercator projection being a big example of how this whole matrix is skewed based on east to west or west to east circumnavigation. But of course, you've got 90 degrees north, 90 degrees south, 180 degrees east, and 180 degrees west. Um, you know, People, again, they'll argue that's because of the way that the map is constructed. But I submit that there's something more to it, and again, I believe it is connected with the path of the sun. The light from the sun traveling across meridional paths more readily than it does sort of latitudinal paths. It just seems to support this argument. So, at any rate, I just thought this was funny that I would share with you guys because, yeah, cartographers are apparently not always to be trusted. When you couple this with the meridian lines being strictly related to the apparent sun, it becomes clear why we have such issues with the maps. We must try to understand that what you see in the sky is not necessarily what you get in reality. Imagine yourself sitting inside a giant series of lenses and observing a distant stationary light source, merely changing its angle around the lens, the angle of attack towards which is facing the lens, and pivoting in a circuit in such a way. You, the observer within the series of lenses, would be very intelligent to figure up the apparent distance to the apparent light. However, the apparent light that you are observing would only be a secondary, intangible phantom of the true source of light. And so any calculations or observations made by such an observer would be totally misguided, although very brilliant and mathematically respectable. We simply cannot understand things that are beyond our realm to understand. In any case, even if the apparent sun is about 3,500 miles up, the fact that the light from such a small object in comparison with the face of the Earth appears to ride the electromagnetic waves going north to south with greater ease than laterally, which apparently causes little observers here on the ground, literally inside a series of lenses, to see conflicting accounts of the apparent sun depending on your position along such meridian lines. During the last several months, as many of you know, we've come to realize that the Earth is flat and, more importantly, stationary, and we know for certain that any possible argument against the truth must have a rational explanation. This is indeed very true, and as mentioned, the fact that this puppy is stationary is even more devastating to a globist's belief system, and we can prove lack of motion in so many demonstrations of physics, while proving flatness only has so many demonstrable experiments, which are certainly logical and good proofs. Now, globists will always refuse to look at sensible evidence you show them, yet will continue believing they live stuck to the side of a spinning sphere zipping around a curve over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, falling around that same curve at over 700,000 feet per hour, while falling around the sun at 66,600 miles per hour, while the sun falls around the galactic center at nearly 500,000 miles per hour, while the galaxy flies off into space at over 1,000,000 miles an hour, just like all the other galaxies. Yet, on a still day, there will not even be a single ripple in a pond, and a butterfly can gently hover above the water and create perfectly circular ripples in the otherwise mirror-still pond by dipping a single leg in the water, and yet all that conflicting motion at mind-boggling speeds will allow for a still pond on a still day, and will allow the dainty little butterfly to act as a geostationary satellite, something that costs NASA and the taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars. All that alleged motion, which is literally impossible to comprehend, would sometimes compound your apparent velocity and other times conflict your apparent velocity, meaning we should be tumbling around like riding the salt and pepper shaker at the fair, but of course gravity and a fixed frame of reference somehow allow our inertia to be fixed to that of the Earth, the Sun, and the galaxy, and a fixed frame of reference so that we don't notice any of the incomprehensible velocities which compound and conflict one another, and depending on the time of day, the time of year, and time of eon. The heliocentric model dictates that we should experience a difference in 66,600 miles per hour plus and minus from day to night, a change in velocity for you on the ground of over 130,000 miles per hour from day to night, yet we don't notice the difference between the Earth racing up towards our feet at 66,000 miles per hour compared to 12 hours later when it's racing away from our feet at 66,000 miles per hour, and every velocity in between, as we fall around a curve at over 1,000 miles per hour near the equator, while simultaneously falling around that curve vertically over 700,000 feet per hour, and don't notice any of these changes in motion ever. Spin around 5 times and tell me if you don't get dizzy. In fact, that's the only way the Earth spins, is if you spin around on a swivel chair too many times, and then the Earth is definitely spinning. Well, okay, if you drink too much and then decide it's a good idea to chief some dank, then the Earth also spins. Or at least the ceiling in your bedroom spins, but that's the best evidence for the spinning Earth I've ever seen or witnessed. Scientists claim that in order to achieve geostationary orbit, you must be traveling nearly 20,000 miles per hour and have an altitude of over 22,000 miles. This is so completely ridiculous because a butterfly hovering over a still lake is technically a geostationary satellite, just like a hot air balloon is technically a geostationary satellite. So is a kite. And by the way, the world record for a single kite is nearly 5,000 meters. As Jeff Stewart pointed out, it might be illegal to launch a geostationary satellite weather balloon at night, but it's totally legal to launch a geostationary satellite kite at night. Just saying to any flat earther kite enthusiasts out there, I suppose Felix Baumgartner is also a geostationary satellite because he was up in the air, not moving whatsoever relative to the ground. Yet for some reason, NASA claims to have satellites in geostationary orbit at 22,000 miles up, which is somehow communicating with a generic little plastic dish stuck to the side of your house. To any flat earther kite enthusiasts out there, if you can get a non-GoPro lens fixed to one of your kites and get that baby up to 5,000 meters at night, I'd love to see what the stars look like. The fact is, the very same satellite dishes are tapping into the very same magnetic flux lines I'm describing, which the radio signals transmitted across vast distances using existing electromagnetic energy waves created by the Earth itself. If invisible waves of energy are capable of bringing high-definition television and internet into your favorite devices, then why is it so hard to believe that light waves can piggyback on the very same electromagnetic matrix created by the Earth? Regardless of our ability to perfectly map the face of the world, it's important, for me at least, to try and find an explanation for anomalies. There's a big piece to this puzzle involving how light bends and how images invert when passing through different sorts of media. Modern science doesn't have an accurate explanation for thunder and lightning. All they have is theories. Going to read a quote from livescience.com to give you some background. This is called All Lightning on Earth May Have Its Roots in Space. New research suggests
lightning flashes on Earth about 100 times per second,
but we never see it from the International Space Station.
But what triggers lightning in thunderstorms remains mostly unknown. Especially odd is the fact that decades of analysis suggest electrical fields within thunderclouds have only a tenth or so of the strength needed to spark a lightning bolt. More than 20 years ago, physicist Alex Gurevich at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow suggested lightning might be initiated by cosmic rays from outer space. These particles strike Earth with gargantuan amounts of energy surpassing anything the most powerful atom smashers on the planet are capable of.
Now, I want to pause real quick and submit that instead of coming from outer space, they're merely coming from the ionosphere, or even possibly coming from, these different magnetic flux lines that I'm describing, but certainly not from outer space, because outer space doesn't exist.
But going back to the quote, when cosmic rays slam into air molecules, they can make them split out huge numbers of electrons. This shower of electrons would collide into still more air molecules, generating more electrons. All in all, cosmic rays could each set off an avalanche of electrons, a chain reaction Gurevich calls a runaway breakdown. However, to kindle lightning, initial calculations suggested very high energy cosmic rays were needed. These are relatively rare. Thunderclouds should each see only one a day, not enough to account for the amount of lightning occurring daily. Electric Earth, stunning images of lightning. The answer to this mystery might lie in how thunderclouds possess vast numbers of electrically charged water droplets and ice nuggets, which Gurevich, and I might add gravity-defying ice nuggets, which Gurevich and his colleagues call hydrometeors. In such energetic surroundings, cosmic rays 10,000 to 100,000 times less energetic than thought could generate the cascades of electrons needed for lightning. Such cosmic rays hit Earth about as often as lightning flashes on the planet.
Or on the plane.
Gurevich and his colleague Anatoly Kurashkin at the Radiophysical Research Institute in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, analyzed radio pulses from nearly 3,800 lightning strikes detected in Russia and Kazakhstan. The nature of these pulses suggests that they might be created by the kind of electrons one could expect to see in the runaway breakdowns from cosmic rays. If correct, this work, quote, could resurrect the notion that cosmic rays are involved in lightning initiation, an idea that has been questioned in recent years, end quote, says physicist Joseph Dwyer, a professor at Florida Institute of Technology, who did not take part in this research. To help confirm or refute this idea, simultaneous measurements of the showers of energetic particles produced by cosmic rays and the radio pulses from lightning are needed. Dwyer explained, quote, such experiments are already being done at several places, end quote, Dwyer told Our Amazing Planet. Gurevich and Kazakhstan detailed their findings May 2nd in the Journal of Physical Review Letters, end quote. And I would just like to add that cosmic rays
are not necessarily coming from light years away. Cosmic rays is probably a misnomer, and what they're referring to as cosmic rays are probably, pulses of energy that are actually generated from the Earth itself, but being reflected or refracted around in, all these different mysterious layers of electromagnetic fields and ionized plasma and atmosphere that we indeed have overhead. So, my theory is that lightning is the charge held by the ionosphere is grounding out. Very simple. All electric circuits must ground out at some point or they will overload. If the sun is actually a mere symptom of an unseen or unobservable electromagnetic phenomenon involved in some type of circuit, with the Earth being a giant Tesla coil or capacitor plate or electromagnet, which it is, then the highly charged ionosphere would need to ground out from time to time, which would explain the phenomenon of lightning a bit more logically than the current theory and a bit more logically than cosmic rays.
Since I was a kid, I've always been interested in storms. As an engineer, I try to understand how things work, so I actually built and designed a device to measure the weather basically on the inside of a tornado. The United States, on average, gets about 1,200 tornadoes per year. And the reason is because of its unique geographic location. You got the Gulf of Mexico off to the south, and these storm systems, as they pass through, draw this Gulf moisture as water vapor. It comes right up through the Midwest. And springtime generally reflects what we call a very active jet stream. And it brings us very powerful winds that just comes right across the Midwest. That in combination allows these big storm systems to develop, and of course wind shear is a very powerful ingredient for tornadoes. The ingredients for a tornado obviously are quite complex, but some of the basics are, you have to have moisture, you have to have lift, and then the other most important ingredient is what they call wind shear. And shear creates these big horizontal rolls in the atmosphere. And then when a thunderstorm forms underneath it, it actually tips these horizontal rolls in the vertical position to where a thunderstorm forms over them. You have the whole thunderstorm rotating. Those final processes are what we're trying to study. What's bringing the rotation finally all the way to the ground. And that's really one of the biggest mysteries of tornado formation. It's very difficult to forecast where a tornado is going to be. When we're actually in the field waiting for thunderstorms to develop, we use what they call visible satellite imagery. This is basically a picture from space showing the best areas, what we call instability. And that's how and where we are able to target these storms that are developing. Ground-based radar can't even see these storms develop, but satellite can. Satellites also detect what we call boundaries. These boundaries left over from old thunderstorms become the focus of new thunderstorms during the day and actually enhance the tornado potential. Visible satellite technology allows us to identify this, which otherwise would be going totally unnoticed and undetected. One of the biggest things that I would love to see in future satellite technology is the ability to actually see lightning within the cloud tops. All the vertical motion and so forth greatly enhances its ability to create lightning. This lightning mapping will actually show frequency. If the storm is becoming severe, the lightning frequency increases, and thus be able to do an early detection of whether or not that storm is severe or not. If we knew more about tornado genesis and structure, and we're able to stretch that warning out to 20 or 25 minutes. Right now, the average time is about 15 minutes or so. That gives people more time to prepare and seek shelter. Without the GOES satellite, we would be back in the dark ages of the mid to early 60s. These GOES satellites are responsible, in my opinion, for saving many, many thousands of lives.
A quick clip from theatlantic.com, and their summary of the clip is quoted as follows, quote,
"In this short NASA documentary, storm researcher Tim Samaras describes how satellite imaging can help predict tornadoes because it's unclear exactly how various weather conditions come together to catalyze a tornado. It's hard to predict them more than 15 minutes in advance," Samaras says. He's hoping that the NOAA and NASA's GOES-R satellites will help change that, end quote.
As if NASA is going to help change anything. All they're going to do is give you better resolution pictures of the same things that we already have. Now, based on my research, only our ability to plot the course of potential tornadoes has increased, as ground-based radar systems have increased. For this meteorologist to point to a Doppler radar reading and call it a satellite image is a testament to his complete trust in NASA and their imaginary satellites. Now, whether that was a Doppler radar reading or even something from a geostationary weather balloon, it certainly wasn't coming from a satellite because satellites don't exist, even the cartoon satellite that he used in his clip. Now, he showed that nifty cartoon of a satellite and started making predictions about how NASA's new satellite will improve tornado warning times. But the fact is, scientists do not understand how tornadoes are formed in the globe Earth model because they don't understand reality. For one thing, geostationary weather balloon satellites could certainly image weather systems far more accurately and clearly than a satellite situated hundreds or even thousands of miles away. We have Doppler radar systems all over the place which adequately map weather systems and accurately predict potential tornadoes and hurricanes based on specific conditions, including cool air potentially clashing with warm air, which is conducive to tornadoes forming. However, you'd think that if NASA was actually going to contribute something to tornado prediction, they'd have done it 1,000 satellites ago. Are you telling me that supposedly putting up more DirecTV satellites and putting up more toys to play with for the astronauts is more important to the government agency known as NASA than saving lives by predicting tornadoes more accurately or more, ahead of time? Shame on them for essentially whoring out our tax-funded space program to the highest bidder, but in fact we know that satellites are not even up there, and Dish Network has been paying NASA to pretend to launch satellites and secretly run fiber optic cables from sea to shining sea, to shining sea, to shining sea, in order to fool people into thinking they have the ability to orbit the planet at 22,000 miles high in order to remain geostationary when a simple weather balloon or even a butterfly is in fact a geostationary satellite for the duration of its ascent, in case of the weather balloon, tens of thousands of feet, which is the perfect vantage point to study large weather patterns and predict tornadoes which might fall outside the range of existing Doppler ground-based systems. At any rate, I submit that NASA is not going to launch any groundbreaking satellite technology to improve tornado forecasting. Surely they'll get higher definition images and better looking animations of the satellites that took the images, but the simple fact is you're never going to do any better than overlapping Doppler systems coupled with high altitude geostationary satellite weather balloons and the occasional flyby of high altitude planes or even drones, which can tell a much better story than a satellite 10,000 or 22,000 miles away. I just really can't believe how gullible some people are. If we consider that the Earth is actually stationary and it is the weather patterns and the ether which are actually spinning overhead, the creation of tornadoes becomes much more sensible and much easier to explain. Tornado season in the U.S. is March through June, so essentially apparently spring. However, if you're not familiar with the term seasonal lag, this means the hottest months of summer actually trail behind the solar peak days by a full month. In other words, solar lag or seasonal lag causes our calendars to mark the seasons a full month after they began in solar terms.
One of the biggest things that I would love to see in future satellite technology is the ability to actually see lightning within the cloud tops. All the vertical motion and so forth greatly enhances its ability to create lightning. This lightning mapping will actually show frequency. If the storm is becoming severe, the lightning frequency increases, and thus be able to do an early detection of whether or not that storm is severe or not. Severe or not. If we knew more about tornado genesis and structure, and we're able to stretch that warning out to 20 or 25 minutes. Right now, the average time is about 15 minutes or so. That gives people more time to prepare and seek shelter. Without the GOES satellite, we would be back in the dark ages of the mid to early 60s. These GOES satellites are responsible, in my opinion, for saving many, many thousands of lives.
So, in solar terms, tornado season in the USA is the end of winter, beginning of spring. Now, why is that time important? Well, again, tornadoes are definitely formed by lower pressure, colder air clashing with higher pressure, warmer air, and somehow forming a vortex feedback loop of sorts, which creates the immense destructive power of the tornado. Now, if the colder winter air in the north is being perturbed by the apparent sun seeming to creep its way back towards the Tropic of Cancer during these months, and sort of dragging with it the warmer air from the southern summer, it makes sense that you'd see such vortex patterns most frequently in the USA during such months, simply due to the stationary nature of the world, the vortex nature of our atmosphere, and the sun acting as sort of a hot mixing spoon, perturbing the fluid-like atmosphere away from its path, causing the opposite cyclonic tendencies depending on the relative position to north or south of the sun. Now, the opposing velocities or the opposing rotational patterns of cyclones is not split strictly at the equator. However, that split follows along with the path of the sun. Now, tornadoes make perfect sense on a flat stationary Earth, and yet they are still a big mystery to modern science in the globe model, and while they rely on NASA to help them predict tornadoes better, they're waiting on Santa Claus to plop down the chimney and bring them presents. It's never going to happen because we can predict tornadoes based on conditional probability, but to assume that NASA has some magic in their non-existing cartoon satellites that is somehow beyond the capability of Doppler or geostationary satellite weather balloons to manage, somehow you need to be in a satellite to have this technology is just beyond naive of meteorologists, since NASA has never improved a single technology except, of course, this technology of propaganda, which is working like a charm. What's up, everybody? Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining me for another video proving the world to be a plane, not a globe. As always, if you'd like to contribute to the channel, you can do so via PayPal to johnelance@gmail.com. That's through PayPal, JONELance@gmail, or you can do straight through my fan funding page. Don't forget to subscribe to the Morgile too, but I just don't want to have my channels taken down. So I've taken some steps to make sure that I don't get any copyright strikes by testing out uploads before I do the ultimate upload. But at any rate, it's just another pain, but it should avoid me from having my stuff getting taken down or prevent it in the long run. So anyways, thanks everyone so much for your support, your continued dedication to the movement. Hopefully we'll get over this division and just move on with the truth, move on with the proof, and just keep on poking holes in the heliocentric lies and keep on proving the flat earth to everybody out there who still doesn't believe it. The simple truth is the simple truth. God bless you all, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out.